right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just give me a second. Just trying to share my screen actually. In today's session, the case presentation will be covered by Dr. Priyasha Suri, and we also have the case expert, Dr. Saral Garg sir, and he's from he's CM cardiology in Mahant Indresh Medical Institute, Dehradun. And we will also be talking about the refractory heart failure surgical solution. And the talk will be by Dr. Ramji Mehrotra, sir, and who is the part of BLK Max Super Specialty Hospital. And I invite everyone to the cardiology echo session, and we can start.
Right. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Anjali. So welcome everyone to our cardiology echo session. This is, as per our syllabus, this is going to be around heart failure and what are the nuances of managing patients with heart failure. To that end, we have a case presentation followed by a discussion, as Anjali has already told you who the people are. And then we will have a very, very interesting talk by our Chief of Cardiac Surgery, Dr. Ramji Mehrotra, on what are the advanced surgical therapies that can be available. So I am joined by my colleague, Dr. Amit Madan, who's an associate consultant in cardiology with us. And I am sure, again, this will turn out to be an interesting and interactive session. So without further ado, may I invite Dr. Salil to take over the session and ask Dr. Priyasha to make her presentation.
Thank you, sir.
So Salil, what we'll do is once Priyasha has finished her case presentation, then we can we'll open the case for some discussion or whatever points there are. And you have made a presentation of some.
Yes, sir. Some around 10-12 slides and one small angiogram. That's about all. The basic idea of the presentation will be that we discuss heart failure as we are treating in peripheries, in hospitals, and actually the way to go forward. Because very small things, everyone I'm quite sure I know out here would be aware of whatever we are talking about. It is just revising the same thing and maybe putting it in the perspective in case somebody has a question, then we can answer that, sir. Following that, with resistant heart failure, Dr. Ramji Mehrotra will certainly take over.
Okay, all right, sure. So let Priyasha take up. Hello, Priyasha, welcome.
Hello, good evening, sir.
So please introduce yourself and what you're doing, and then start with your case.
Good evening, everybody. I am Dr. Priyasha Suri.
You're on mute?
No, sir.
I can hear, sir.
You are muted, Priyasha?
No, sir.
She's audible.
She's not muted. I can hear her. I can.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Dr. Priyasha, you're audible. You're good to go.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I am Dr. Priyasha Suri. I am currently doing my junior residency in the Department of Cardiology at Mahant Indresh Hospital. I graduated from Manipal College of Medical Sciences, Pokhara, Nepal in 2019. I will be presenting a case presentation today.
One second. Priyasha, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm not able to hear anyone. Something has happened here.
So you can log in again. You can log in again.
Anjali, are you able to hear me? I don't know why. What has happened here? 1 second, please.
We all can, sir.
I've managed to mute myself.
Is everybody able to see the presentation?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
What happened? लैपटॉप में ये कनेक्शन में आवाज नहीं आ रही है कहाँ से? I'm not able to hear. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
We can, sir.
Okay. 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 ये login फिर से करना है. So please ask Priyasha to go ahead with the presentation. I'm logging in. Please ask her to go ahead with the presentation.
May I go forward?
Yes, yes, you can go ahead.
Okay. I'll be presenting a case. We had a 50-year-old male who presented to the OPD with chief complaints of angina on exertion grade 3 and dyspnea on exertion grade 3 for the past 4 to 5 months, which increased in severity over the past 15 days. The patient was non-motensive, was non-diabetic, but he did have a history of smoking, which was about 30 pack years. Patient has no history of alcohol consumption or illegal drug use. Since we are going through a pandemic, a negative history is very important these days, which includes a negative history of fever, chills, cough, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, or abdominal pain. After that, we reviewed the systems thoroughly, which include the respiratory system. Patient had bilateral air entry with bilateral basal crypts. The cardiovascular system was also reviewed. It showed the presence of S1, S2, and S3. The abdomen on palpation was soft and non-tender. The patient was conscious and oriented to time, place, and person. On examination of the neck, the JVP was raised 4 centimeters above the level of the sternal angle. And on examination of the extremities, the patient had bilateral edema up to mid-shin. On further examination, the vital signs were noted down. Patient had a pulse rate of 78 beats per minute, which was regular and hypokinetic. All the peripheral pulses we were able to palpate all the peripheral pulses. The patient had a BP of 110 by 80 mmHg, phase 5. The temperature was recorded at 98.6 degree Fahrenheit with a respiratory rate of 20 per minute and an oxygen saturation of 98% on room air. Certain lab investigations were done, which revealed a hemogram of 13.2, a total leukocyte count of 10,100, and serum urea of 70, serum creat of 1.8, serum sodium for 131, serum potassium for 5.4. The most important being the pro-BNP, which made us point towards the diagnosis. The pro-BNP level was 13 picogram per ml. This is the ECG. The ECG present here revealed Q waves in leads 3 AVF, and there was T wave inversion in V3 to V6. The ECG also showed bifid P wave in lead V1, which tells us about the left atrial enlargement, and the poor progression of R waves in chest leads. The main, this ECG basically tells us.
Can you go back to show the ECG while you're reading this? Yeah. So read the ECG findings again that you found.
The ECG showed. Where's my pen? The ST elevation in 2, 3, and AVF, and bifid P wave in V2. It's not the
V1,
quality in V1.
Yeah. Poor precision of R waves and Q waves in inferior leads. Okay.
Right.
An echo was done for further evaluation. The echo revealed a global hypokinesia of the left ventricle, an akinetic LAD territory, a severe LV systolic dysfunction with a left ventricular ejection fraction of 23%, a dilated left atrium and the left ventricle, along with mild mitral regurgitation, mitral tricuspid regurgitation, and grade 3 left ventricular diastolic dysfunction. The chest X-ray was also done as a part of initial evaluation, which showed prominent interstitial markings, and cardiomegaly was also noted.
So go back. We don't want to see this. Go back. Yeah. So I think, Dr. Priyasha, do you think with such a clinical presentation,
Sir.
Confirmation by pro-BNP or is neither necessary nor is it diagnostic?
Sir.
But we can maybe understand later on why. What is the role of the BNP peptides in heart failure? This is obviously very clearly, clinically, the patient is in congestive heart failure from whatever you have described. So, Dr. Madan, would you like to add anything regarding the clinical presentation or the investigations? Would you, you've seen the, so what is the symptom? Can we go back to the first slide? What is the symptom presentation? Yeah. So how long what was the duration of these symptoms?
The patient had these symptoms for about 4 to 5 months, which increased in severity over the past 15 to 20 days.
Right, right.
One surprising thing is sinus bradycardia. Although in any kind of stress or ongoing angina or ongoing heart failure, we predominantly tend to see tachycardia.
Right, right, right.
Yes, you are right, sir. However, in this case, by the time these patients do present to us, they have been taking therapies outside. Like this gentleman came at night. At that time, now this examination which Priyasha has presented is the next morning. When he had presented to the emergency, apparently he was quite breathless and maybe tachycardia would have been recorded.
Right.
As is the finding that on echo we have got mild TR and JVP is not all that raised. This is following the treatment which was given to him in the emergency.
Right.
The point
Dr.
is
Seema,
that
would you like to any comments? Dr. Seema is here. I think any comments on the ECG? Is it pointing us to any kind of clue as to what is going on?
Sorry, sir, I missed the ECG.
Yeah, so we can present the ECG.
Yeah, we like to hear her on ECGs.
So this is a middle-aged male presenting with dyspnea and angina-like symptoms, and with obviously very clear clinical features of congestive heart failure in terms of gallop and progressive symptoms and pedal edema and JVP also, isn't it?
I don't think there is anything very, very remarkable in the ECG, and ECG is quite narrow, complex also.
Yes.
So
yes.
not suggestive of any dilatation. There is a, am I clear here? V3 is, Asha, this is V4. Little bit of LVH may be there. I am not sure.
Right.
And T-wave inversion could be secondary to that.
I agree. I don't think this ECG is pointing us in any, the kind of Q waves that are there in the inferior leads are also a very minuscule. You cannot use them to make any diagnosis. There's little inverted P wave in lead V1, but nothing to suggest any LA or RA enlargement, neither lead 2 nor. So I think quite an unremarkable ECG. So not really helping us to go in any particular direction. So this is the clinical presentation of a patient who has come with, and the echo is showing that there is significant LV dysfunction. So Dr. Amit Pendarkar is also here. So Dr. Amit, how would you, what do you think now? What should we do with this patient? Does this patient need further evaluation, or what, in terms of the investigations also, what we have seen is that this patient has an elevated creatinine level of 1.8. And yeah.
And I believe that the patient does not have any other comorbidity.
No, the patient had no underlying comorbidity.
The first thing is we have to do the first thing will be to stabilize the patient, giving him symptomatic improvement. Second thing is we have to find out the etiology of heart failure, which is quite most really it appears to be that he's having coronary artery disease. Before that, I would like to add one thing, that his ECG had also had shown peak T waves, and his potassium is high, 5.4.
Correct.
That was in this thing. So we would like to evaluate him for coronary artery disease by an angiogram. Once he is fit enough to undergo coronary angiogram, he should be subjected to coronary angiogram.
But I think, like you rightly said, we need to put this patient first to improve his symptoms, and then also put him on the standard therapies that are known to improve prognosis and outcomes in heart failure. So what do you think should have been what is the consensus today? So what is the treatment that this patient was put on?
This patient was, this is after the emergency treatment was done. In emergency, the patient was given a bolus of Lasix, 40 milligrams, with oxygen therapy, because there were basal cramps were present, and the patient was also given a loading dose of aspirin, clopidogrel and atorva, because to treat the underlying ischemic disease. And then the patient was brought up to the cardiac care unit, where an angiogram was done, followed by a...
We'll come to the angiogram and all later. Right now, I think we all agree that this patient is in congestive heart failure with abnormalities in his electrolytes as well as his creatinine. So we need to, there's no acute coronary syndrome, so there's no need to rush into doing an angiogram. So this patient probably should ideally be stabilized and improved clinically. And then, as part of the protocol to try and identify what is the cause of congestive heart failure, then an angiogram might be indicated. But at the moment, so will anyone like to comment on
what we did was, and which is what Priyasha is trying to say, that the first thing which we did was to stabilize the patient. And
right.
The angiogram was done around 3 to 4 days later. So the angiogram we'll be coming to later on. At this time, we would just like, Priyasha, do you have another slide on this?
No, we don't want to get into very complicated flow charts and theoretical discussion. We want to know, basis of this, that if such a patient came today, what will be the line of, guideline directed line of treatment that, we should be. Dr. Madan, would you like to tell us that should this patient be started on, say, now instead of ACE inhibitors, is ARNI an appropriate choice to start in the first, within the first acute hospitalization itself? Or, and what about beta blockers? Would you choose metoprolol, or would you choose any other beta blockers? What about the dose of the MRAs? How would you, design this patient's treatment so that we have got symptomatic benefit, which is obtained with diuretics, but we also want to improve their prognosis and outcomes?
As a presenting ECG was showing suggestive of sinus bradycardia, and the presentation is also of basal cramps and S3 and congestive heart failure. So beta blocker I'll hold for as of now, simply because of heart rate and because patient in active heart failure. That too, a long-acting BD dose is quite high dose, considering all the factors of the presentation of the patient. And then discussion about ACE inhibitor. So in the last 1 or 2 years, we have received 2 trials where we can, in hospital start the ARNI, and we do not need to wait for long so that patient gets stabilized and give a trial of ACE inhibitor and then maybe shift to ARNI. Rather, we can on the go from the very beginning, we can begin with the ARNI, provided creatinine and potassium are in control. But again, potassium was on high normal side in our patient already, which was 5.4. So again, it's a bit dicey starting ARB or ARNI or whatever. So
one of the important aspects when we discuss about patients like these, and which is very important, is that a lot of these patients are coming with pre-renal symptoms. Like for example, the urea creatinine and all is also indicative of that. And this is a fallacy which is what we would like to address during our talk, because a lot of people are put on fluid restrictions. So where by the time the patients are coming to us, a lot of them are in a hodgepodge of medical treatment. Somebody is on some kind of a beta blocker, which may not be required at that time, even with a heart rate of 55. Somebody might be on diuretics. Somebody would be on diuretics, ACE inhibitors, ARNIs, beta blockers, Evabrad, D-Works. Whatever we have heard is generally given to the patients. And on top of that, we have got fluid restriction, with the result that a lot of them are coming to us with these kind of urea creatinine KFT.
So that's true. So the idea is to remove the hodgepodge and confusion, and give the right prescription for this particular patient. So I think
Exactly.
So I think very good points made by Dr. Madan, that sustained long-acting beta blocker in the acute hospitalization stage is not a good idea. Definitely no. And I think you should use short-acting beta blockers and a little bit at a low dose, especially in patients in a decompensated state. Secondly, I think his point about ARNI is valid. If we did not have a potassium of 5.4 and a creatinine of 1.8, instead of starting with an ACE inhibitors in this patient with heart failure, we can directly start with an ARNI. And if the blood pressure is allowing, we may initiate at a lower dose and then up titrate. And that should be the correct strategy. Go to your treatment slide again. Similarly, this aldactone MRAs are desirable for heart failure, but then obviously after the potassium is corrected. So Dr. Amit, what would you say about the fluid restriction and the pre-renal causes of rise in serum creatinine, like Dr. Garg has clearly pointed out, a very, very important point. What would your strategy be regarding fluid intake of this patient, and how to optimize and so that whatever pre-renal element for the creatinine can be removed?
So I think whenever the patient presents to us with deranged kidney function test, his creatinine is high, potassium is also on the higher side. And so first, it's difficult to ascertain that the deranged kidney function test is due to the pre-renal component, or there is an associated renal dysfunction also, because we can have a cardiorenal syndrome. So I think a very good criteria is we can get an idea once, because this patient will require decongestion. After decongestion, the trend in the kidney function test gives us an idea. If the patient's renal function test, we'll see if they start improving, we'll get an idea that he was congested. And even the congestion also, the LVF, acute decompensated heart failure itself, can cause raised deranged kidney function test. So that is, and what we have to remember, that we should not, the patient should not be dry, because the LV also, a failing heart will require raised filling pressures to have an optimum cardiac output. Right. So that is one factor which we have to, it's acceptable to have an elevated and diastolic pressure in a severe elevated systolic dysfunction. So we should not, the patient should not be dry. And if the urea starts increasing significantly, and it's a clear and the patient marker that we are going towards pre-renal component.
So will anyone like to comment upon how we are able to assess pre-renal azotemia in terms of any parameters that we might be measuring, which can give us an indication that we are over diuresing or keeping this patient too dry, which is contributing to increasing pre-renal azotemia. As far as we feel, this patient clearly needs to be decongested. we can assess the volume status by various parameters such as skin turgor, dryness of the tongue, pedal edema or not. What is the blood pressure? What is the pulse pressure? And more than this, we also look at how the trends in the urea and creatinine are behaving. If we are aggressively diuresing the patient and the creatinine levels are rising, it clearly shows us that this is a pre-renal component and we need to downgrade and sometimes give these patients IV fluids also alongside. So a difficult way is to assess what is the correct volume status to maintain. As these patients have got LV dysfunction, they need an adequate preload for that LV to work, but we need to keep that preload to a controllable extent that the symptoms do not become worse. So if there are any thoughts on this,
one of the important factors which I would like to bring in is that in all these patients, and especially these are the patients who do come to us at night. Now, most of us believe that treatment for heart failure is what is given. Like this is a prescription which was written in the emergency after the injection Lasix was given, furosemide, diuretics was given. Now we have to realize that whenever we are treating with heart failure and patients who come to us, one is the emergency room treatment. The second is the treatment which we give on the next day. And the third is the modified treatment which we give from the third day onwards. And the dynamic treatment keeps on changing as we keep on evaluating and the patient stays with us or we discharge him and he keeps on coming.
Sure. Now, Salil, we are with you on that. We are now, just trying to dissect out that what would be the best scenario. And you're right, these are dynamic things. They keep changing as the patient's clinical condition changes. So there's a question from Kushal that comment on the benefits of low dose diuretic infusion like Lasix infusion 1 milligram per hour. So would anyone like to take that question? Maybe Dr. Madan, who's treating a lot of patients, and we give a lot of people diuretic. What is the correct role of Lasix infusion? When should be given, and when should we stop it? When do you think is the right time?
I think if the patient is predominantly acute active heart failure, then there's a role of injectable loop diuretics, and in particular we can give Lasix infusion. Then obviously determining the volume status of the patient by all those methods, that is pedal edema, then blood pressure, then that JVP findings by basal Krebs can guide us the true dose of the diuretics. So to begin with, mostly we start with this dose only.
Okay. So I think acutely decompensated heart failure is when the patient should be given an IV infusion of Lasix. And then this can be tapered to a lower dose and then intermittent dosing and then to switch to oral, I think. Do you agree, Dr. Amit?
Yeah, definitely. And the benefit of Lasix infusion is that there is a less of hemodynamic changes. So when the patient is significantly symptomatic, it is not going to work. We have to give bolus doses. Yeah. And once the patient has some symptomatic improvement, then we can start a Lasix infusion. And
I would agree with you, sir, because there was a study which compared both these things, a continuous IV infusion with bolus. However, in practice, what we find is what you have said is absolutely correct. That there is a difference, though they had said that both are similar. There is a difference with once we have an active heart failure.
Right. So, but Kushal's dose was 1 milligram per hour. That's no dose. It's either 10 milligram per hour or 5 milligram per hour. That's the standard dose. If it's coming less than that, you can switch, I think, to bolus doses rather than this thing. All right. So, anyone else would like to make any comments or add any points to? Now, we haven't talked about another very important class of drugs, that is the SGLT2 inhibitors. And I think in 2021, we must talk about SGLT2 inhibitors. And we must also talk about ivabradine. So these are two important therapeutic advances. So
yes,
Dr. Salil, are you going to be telling to
yes,
us
sir. So what I will be doing is that we will go on every drug and every aspect of management on a slide each, giving 2 to 3 minutes for each therapy.
So
Can I share my screen?
we have Hemant, Dr. Hemant Madan with us. Hemant, any questions or any comments on the discussion so far? Would you like to add anything?
Sir, I was in and out because of, some calls from the hospital. I
Okay.
just wondered, whether we talked about one IVC measurement as assessment for, we did, or maybe I missed out. I'm not
We
very
didn't.
sure.
We didn't talk about it. Sir. We didn't
Yeah,
talk
so
about
I find that a very useful tool to measure the hydration component of a
it. I
patient.
agree.
And this is something that as cardiologists we aren't often trained to do. We at least in the period that we were trained in, IVC measurement was not a part of a routine echocardiographic examination, but I increasingly find it a very useful tool of measurement of the fluid status of a patient.
Right.
The second component.
Yeah, sorry. Please go ahead. Please complete.
Yeah, the second thing is something which is kind of which has been a practice since times immemorial and needs to be emphasized again and again, is the role of bed rest in a failing heart. Very often you find that same patients, they start responding wonderfully to same group of medicines when you admit them and when you kind of ensure enforced bed rest. So bed rest is another component. It may sound very stupid talking about it in a cardiac meeting, but it's something which is so basic and so often ignored that very often you find that patients, you admit them in 2 days on the same therapy, they get better because you've just enforced bed rest.
Very excellent point. Very excellent point.
Very
Simple
good point,
bed rest and maybe a little supplemental oxygen therapy will promote
Yes.
vasodilation, will remote reabsorption of fluid from the interstitium, will promote, make your diuretics more effective, will get the patients. So I think very, very important practical point that patients who are in heart failure should be admitted initially to stabilize. And, sometimes this is just that all that is required. The tachycardia comes down, the stress levels come down.
The renal failure settles down.
Yeah.
The same fluid actually leads to a better perfused heart. So, all those things, all those little things, they add up in a failing heart.
So do we have any cardiac anesthetists or anyone else in the audience who can tell us a little bit about, fluid assessment, fluid status assessment, or any physician or anyone would like to, give us any inputs? So one of the things that the physicians and in the ICU that I'm seeing is that the physicians, the ICU people are looking at lung ultrasound along with the IVC diameter and collapsibility. And lung ultrasound also is able to give a lot of information. Yes.
Hello, sir. I am audible, sir.
Yes. Please go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, sir. I am Dr. Sandeep Joshi from CTVS Cardiac Anesthesia Department, sir.
Yes, Sandeep, please.
Yes, sir. I just want to highlight one point, sir. These patients, when present with the acute decompensation, the only one thing, first priority is first to give the supplemental oxygen to the patient, because we have to balance the supply and the demand of the heart. And the second most important thing is that when we give oxygen, we start from the our oxygen therapy in our ICU. We start from the from nasal prong, give to the non-invasive ventilation by BiPAP. And if the patient requires further, we have to intubate the patient and reduce his work of breathing. Only then the patient will come out very good. And another important is the use of the rational use of the inotrope. Because if you see the echo report, the patient LV dysfunction is already, I think, 23% is mentioned.
Yes.
And the judicial use of the inotrope is very important. The most important thing I want to highlight on this is the patient is already a chronic patient of heart failure. So already these receptors or the beta receptors are already down-regulated in such patients. So whenever we are using, we have to choose, though adrenaline, non-ad, we are using to support the hemodynamics, but we have to choose the other, inodilator things which act by different mechanism to increase contractility and reduce the afterload and help in ejection of the heart. So for that thing, this milrinone and levosimendan are the agent of the choice nowadays people are using.
Okay, very good. So very important point from the cardiac anesthetist that
and second important point, sorry sir, just one point more. And whenever we are trying to intubate that patient, but make sure you have a central venous pressure CVP line in situ is always be a good thing if you have, because the thing is these patients have already reduced ejection fraction and a high sympathetic drive. The moment you give this anesthetic drugs to intubate this patient, you knock out the sympathetic drive and you immediately your patient will crash out. So before intubating them, first inline all the inotropes and make sure they are all in the working condition. And you have even choose this incremental bolus of mifentrine or ephedrine in head with you. So these are the two things I think one should must take into consideration while this putting this patient in the ventilator.
Okay, very, very good, insightful point, Sandeep. Thank you so much. That if the patient requires ventilation, what are the strategies to successfully ventilate and prevent this patient from crashing? What level of inotropes, what kind of inotropes to use? So I think very, very good and useful points. Thank you. Thank you. So Salil, do you have
Yes,
a
sir.
presentation now? So the field is
Yes,
yours.
sir.
Anyone else would like to add any other points?
Can I share screen, Anjali? Can you see my screen, please?
Sir, I cannot see your screen, but you have access to share screen.
Yeah, I am pressing the share screen kind of thing, but how should I go about it? Share. Okay.
The previous speaker has to stop
Acha, yeah.
sharing.
I think Priyasha, you have to stop sharing. Am I visible?
Yeah, your
Screen is visible.
screen is visible.
My screen is visible, sir?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we have this. So basically, we will just be going through I think my screen has gone blank.
So we can see your screen with the presentation.
Okay. So what we are going to do is just discuss the points a bit and go on to the management. So I don't know, I can't see my. Can you see anything? I don't know, it suddenly seems to have gone blank.
You can share it again. You can open the screen at your backend and then you can share.
We can see you, Salil.
But I can't see anyone.
Okay, Salil, if you are having a problem, Dr. Ramji Mehrotra is with us. Maybe we can have his presentation while you get your act together. Or you
Yes,
want?
actually, mine was absolutely ready. I don't know what went wrong.
This is called Murphy's Law.
Can you see it now, sir?
Anjali, please come in and help Dr. Salil through all this.
Sir, you can open your presentation at the back
Okay,
end.
is it now? Is it visible now?
Yes, sir, visible.
Okay, so we have already discussed this, and an important point which Dr. Sandeep had said was, and this is a very important point for the ICU settings, because a lot of time when we
Salil, you have 10 more minutes only. All right.
Yes,
so
sir.
quickly rush through.
Yes, sir. So the important point is, of course, the lifestyle changes, which we all know. So I will now only be emphasizing on the points which I wanted to talk about, sir. One of the important aspects, of course, is treatment of the underlying cause, and in this case, for example, it was ischemic heart disease. Now, this is the very important slide, because this is something which I have been seeing day in, day out, that water restriction to less than 1.5 liters. Every case of congestive heart failure, every case of heart failure, this is a prescription which is written all across the country, sir. Now, there is no necessity for water restriction. I went through a lot of literature on this, and the only indications for water restriction are if a patient is hyponatremic or is in end stage heart failure, when fluid retention is difficult to control in spite of high diuretics. Otherwise, if your kidneys are working fine, take in as much of water orally as you can, it will come out, sir. This is a very important factor, because this is what leads us to the cardiorenal syndromes also, and azotemia in the patients that we are treating with. Today, let us remember one thing, that most of the drugs that we are giving are nephrotoxic.
What is your take on sodium reduction? How much sodium chloride does that equal to?
So this is about what we are taking is around 2 to 3 grams. I think a standard therapy of not adding salt to our diet is a good thing, but not severely restricting it, because there are two aspects to it, three aspects to it rather. One is that a lot of patients of ours are on diuretics and are losing a lot of salt. Point one. Point two, a lot of them, we live in a hot climate. A lot of people keep on sweating a lot. So our salt loss is far more than what is there in the temperate climates. And third is that a lot of patients, especially if they are educated, if you tell them to restrict salt, they stop salt. Now, salt is a very important ingredient of our diet. So restricting it to around 3 grams or so is a sufficient, no added, common run of the mill or a thumb rule, good thumb rule is do not add salt to it.
Okay, so carry on then. Carry on, please.
This was, of course, the for patients who have got ischemic heart disease. Now, this is an important thing, because ACE inhibitors and ARBs have been the cornerstone of heart failure treatment for the last 20 years. They are a class 1 indication, and both ACE inhibitors and ARBs are similar in efficacy. And one of the important factors which we need to bring out at this time is that only in certain very, very rare conditions can we combine them with ARNIs. Otherwise, they are not to be combined with ARNIs. In fact, ARNIs have to be started after nearly 36 hours of washing out of ACE inhibitors. The other are beta blockers, as I think Dr. Madan pointed out very rightly, that when the patient has come to us with acute, it is short-acting beta blockers that we need to add, and gradually there are three groups, three particular beta blockers that have been studied in extensively. That is carvedilol, bisoprolol, metoprolol. All three have shown nearly equal efficacy in the management of heart failure, both in reducing the morbidity and mortality. The idea is to start beta blockers today as early as patient can tolerate, and to the best maximum possible doses that the patient can. Now, this is the new kid on block, sacubitril valsartan, commonly sold to us as Sidmus, as MADA or Vimada. And it was the paradigm trial which actually brought it out. Now, this is a drug which is recommended unless contraindicated. The contraindications are the usual suspects of hyperkalemia and raised serum creatinine. And as Dr. Madan brought out, yes, there are studies, and today we can start these drugs in the hospital during the first admission only. That is where the patient has the wherewithal of affording it, because one particular strip of 10 costs around 750. So it is a very expensive treatment, but no doubt, there is no doubt about it that it's a wonderful therapy. Diuretics, these are again the cornerstone of our therapy. And in patients with fluid retention, they are to be given unless contraindicated. We have 4 varieties which are major therapies which we give. One are loop diuretics, thiazide diuretics, potassium sparing, and AVP antagonists. Loop diuretics are the ones which we use most often, and they give us very good results. Thiazide diuretics are again very good drugs to use. However, and in fact, in refractory heart failure, we use a lot of metolazone. Then ivabradine or the funny channel inhibitors. This is again a drug which has been a game changer, and they are recommended for symptomatic NYHA 1 to 2 class patients with chronic chronic stable angina and heart failure. Now, they are to be, as per recommendations, they are to be after beta blockers at a maximum dose and the sinus rhythm with a heart rate of more than 70 beats per minute. However, important caveat and an important therapy thing in this is that a lot of patients of ours may not be maintaining blood pressures of say 110, 100 and even a systolic. And in these patients, maybe when we cannot, I am not very sure about this, in whom we cannot exhibit a beta blocker, maybe Ivabrad is a good idea to reduce the heart rate. Then SGLT2 inhibitors, again the new therapy and a good, very good drug, the dapagliflozin, empagliflozin, the canagliflozin. These are important drugs in today's therapy to be certainly given if possible. They would certainly be recommended for a patient who got diabetic and who's got poor LV systolic function. The drugs, they can also be given, and we have been using them quite often in patients with who are non-diabetics but with heart failure. The third is the patients with a preserved ejection fraction. In these, they are still not recommended to a very large extent, but we have found good results with these drugs. But of course, these are anecdotal reports and more than that. The other thing are aldactone receptor antagonists. The common ones are aldactone and eplerenone, used extensively in heart failure management. However, the problem is hyperkalemia. Now we have got 3 drugs which are causing hyperkalemia. One are ACE inhibitors, ARNIs, even beta blockers. And on top of that, we use aldosterone receptor antagonists. There is a trend where people write lacilactone without even bothering about it, using furosemide and aldactone, which is 20 and 50. Now that with these drugs is a very wrong practice and is one of the leading causes of hyperkalemia. The reason for that is very simple. Lacilactone was not designed for heart failure. It was designed for cirrhotics. Later on, when the RALS trial came in, we started using lacilactone and Rytau Plus. And with at that time, if you look at RALS trial, except for ACE inhibitors where they added, they did not have any of the other drugs which were causing hyperkalemia. So once we start off and once we go through the recommendations, we also realize that the recommended dose for starting aldactone is 12.5, eplerenone 25 milligrams, which we should upgrade slowly, keeping in view the serum potassium and gynecomastia. A drug which is very close to my heart and which is actually the only oral inotrope available in the world is digoxin. And this is a drug which is more sinned against than it has. It is a class 2 indication today, inhibits sodium potassium ATPase pump, as we say. The dosage generally which we give 0.25 milligrams per day. A very interesting thing is that the DIG Radiance and PROVE study never showed increased mortality or morbidity. They in fact reduced the hospital admissions. However, there was some increase with arrhythmic deaths, and that is why this thing went out. Now, there are 2 or 3 things which are to be taken care of once a patient is on digoxin. Monitor the patient closely. The second aspect is if there's atrial fibrillation, it's a very good drug to give. The third thing is that if we can keep a watch on the electrolytes, that is sodium and potassium, that is potassium, because both hypokalemia and hyperkalemia aggravate the arrhythmic effect of this drug. Then hydralazine and isosorbide nitrate, commonly sold as isolazine. These are very good drugs to have in black patients, and the second is patients with raised serum urea creatinine. However, they have lots of side effects, and that is a major limiting factor because hydralazine, a lot of people cannot tolerate. Then we come to, and this will in all probability be the second last slide.
Yeah. So Salil, I think, this is, we are trying to run short of time. I think you made some excellent points that regarding what are the ideal guideline directed therapies, what is the place of these therapies. And of course, in this, I'm glad you mentioned about digoxin, because that is a drug which is grossly underused as it fell out of repute. But this has got clearly a place, and we can discuss about that at some other point. So now let's just conclude with what you did with this patient and how is the patient doing now?
Now the patient had a akinetic LED territory, so and LCX also had a lesion which was CTO, and RCO was the only surviving therapy artery with close to 90% stenosis. So what we went ahead and stented it. Following that, the patient has actually, because this is a recent case, he has to come to our OPD. But by the time he had left the hospital, he was quite well. His NYHA status had improved. I'm just looking forward that once he comes to us, then I want to do his echo again and maybe see if the ejection fraction is improved.
So do you attribute his improvement to your good guideline directed medical therapy or due to
Certainly, sir.
the stent in your CA? Because
I would rather
supply only about 10% of the myocardium, and I don't.
Yes, sir. I would rather do the goal-directed medical therapy. And in fact, one of the very, very interesting things which I have seen, I have not been able to, I just wanted to bring it out, where a lot of patients, their LV systolic function seems to improve after they have been given proper therapy for heart failure.
Of course, definitely. If you reduce their preload, their MR reduces, their LV size reduces, their ejection fraction also improves, especially now in the age of ARNI. We've seen that there is an improvement of ejection fraction in a significant fraction of our patients. So I think the reason for doing an intervention in a patient with obviously an ischemic, with a dilated cardiomyopathy is, even if the LV function is not going to improve after your intervention, at least it will not deteriorate further once that 90% lesion progresses to produce either an MI or further, becomes 100% and there's further reduction. So maybe that is the rationale.
There's another important rationale, sir. It's something like this, that if you give 10 grace marks to a chap who gets 30% marks, he passes the exam, he gets 40. Though the same may not be true for somebody who's got an 80%, because that just takes him to 90%. So the difference may be between passing and failing.
That's a good simile. I hope it's true. All right. So thank you so much. It's an interesting case and good points of discussion. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ramji Mehrotra. Come. Take off your mask. Take your mask off. Yeah. So Dr. Ramji is going to take us through in the next 10 minutes or 12 minutes into a very interesting journey. But when all these medical treatments fail, then we have to fall back on the surgeon who are, adept at performing high-risk surgeries with good outcomes. And Dr. Ramji is a very, very experienced cardiac surgeon. So it's going to be a very interesting, talk from him regarding advanced therapies for the surgical management of heart failure. So over to Dr. Ramji. Would you share the screen? Can you see our screen? No.
Yes, sir, we can.
Can you? Yeah. So good evening, my friends, and thank you, Bhala, for your kind words and introduction. I'm very pleased that heart failure case was discussed before me. So my job in defining heart failure and its types is kind of sorted out. We all know that most of the time, the heart failure can be managed medically also. But as we know that the components of the heart, like coronary artery, the valves, the myocardium, the conduction system, all can result in their diseases to progression of the heart failure. And the patients who are not managed on optimal medical therapy are definitely candidates for something surgical. And this is stage D patients, which we will concentrate on. So basically, surgery has a couple goals, like to salvage the hearts which are having a chance to get salvaged. The second people are where myocardium has had irreversible changes because of the disease process, and you have only mechanical supports available or they're worked up for the transplant. So coming to the salvageable myocardium, we all know 15–20% ejection fraction patients with significant proximal coronary artery disease, especially proximal ostial LAD involving with triple vessel disease or left main. With, of course, you have gone through those patients' history. They have symptoms of angina or angina equivalent. ECG shows R-wave preservation. Echo shows a kinetic territory but preserved myocardium. And if you need to do some perfusion viability studies, you may do that. But overall, these patients are very salvageable. Of course, maybe with little higher risk than normal, but these patients stand a chance to improve the ejection fraction, improve the symptoms, and at least help recovery or management of heart failure with surgery and medicines in tandem. So many of these patients may continue to need heart failure support medication, but doing surgery and surgical aspect being taken care of will stand them a good chance to get managed on medical therapy. The coronary artery disease sometimes results in mechanical complications like ischemic MR, LV aneurysms. So LV aneurysm reduction or LV aneurysm repair surgery also is indicated in many of these patients where we establish the geometry of the ventricle. We take away the aneurysm so that the loss of stroke volume in that segment is taken care of. Of course, ensuring that the resultant ventricle is not shortened too much as to have diastolic and systolic dysfunction. So we all know that Starling's mechanism, that if you have size correction, the ejection fraction or the performance of the ventricle will increase. These are the aims of reconstruction surgery. We call DOR procedure. I will have to show you some slides. Can we go back on? You want to show your case? No, some of the. So this is some of the slides I have with my own cases. So this is, you can see the popped out LV aneurysm, the big one in the LAD territory. The whole myocardium is scarred. I am going to incise this one. When we open up, there is a lot of, that's all right. We have clots which are removed. You can appreciate that there is a hole. There is a mouth of the sac, and this is whole scar which is opened up. And with a patch, we have reconstructed in a way that LV geometry, LV size correction, everything has been taken care of. And mind you, when the aneurysm forms, the papillary muscles also fall apart, and it may result in type 3B mitral regurgitation. When we do this DOR procedure, these papillary muscles also come together. The tenting of the PML is taken care of, and this is self-reduces the MR. So you have less volume overload, you have shape of the ventricle restored, and this helps in increase of ejection fraction and performance, symptom relief, and survival advantage to these patients. Coming to some of the valvular aspect, as we know, the valve problems may result in LV dysfunction or the other way too. If the myocardial problem has caused LV dilatation, the mitral regurgitation may be secondary to this process. And taking care, MR feeds on itself. You can see when heart dilates, more MR occurs because of the papillary muscle dysfunction, and type 3 MR increases. It produces more volume overload. and it increases work on heart and also jeopardizes the blood supply to the myocardium and demand of oxygen on the heart. So taking care of MR, this is the Bolling hypothesis, also results in reduced volume overload, ventricular correction, ventricular geometry correction, and improves ventricular function. So my point is that we should investigate patients who have correctable lesions, even if that it stands to improve some of the ejection fraction, so that at least some of them will not need heart failure medication any longer. And many of them, if still they need heart failure medication, they will be managed well than OMT alone. Similarly, the CRT therapy, where conduction system has been involved, where there is dysynchrony on ventricular contractions. So if we do correct the MR reduction, the ejection fraction improvement, and symptom and survival improvement has been shown. Now coming to patients who have progressed to irreversible damage to the ventricle, what we do now. So there are mechanical support devices available, and it has been shown that left ventricular assist device is much superior to optimal medical therapy when it has failed to control the symptom and it has failed to control the patient's symptoms and condition. This Intermax helps us triage those patients. So if this is category 6, 7, they are too well for device and we may just manage them on medical therapy. 2, 3, 4 people are adequate and appropriate for durable long-term wear, either as a bridge to help them be a candidate for transplant or at least for a destination therapy. Intermax 1 are the patients where they have significant compromise of the cardiac output, and they are crashing, and where there is no disease and we have not even worked them up. So these patients are given mechanical support in order to buy time to make a decision what they're heading for, or at least give them the chance of recovery, at least say in myocarditis patients or any other correctable patients like CAD or valvular therapy, surgical, wherever there is available, or at least to find time to help them for destination VAD or transplant workup. So this helps us triage. Again, I will have to go back because these are the slides which we had recognized. So, as I said, these mechanical support devices are short-term. Some are long-term. They're paracorporeal, where they are hooked outside the body, or intracorporeal, that the devices are lying in the pericardial or peritoneal cavity, pulsatile or continuous flow, and full or partial support devices, and assist devices which assist the ventricular function or total artificial heart. So coming to short-term devices again, as a bridge to decision or recovery, or bridge to LVAD or transplant. IABP is the first really available and is very good but modest device available to help balance the demand-supply ratio on ischemic myocardium or valvular myocardium, and helps to tide over the increased surgical risk in these patients. If patients are beyond IABP support need, then percutaneous circulatory assist devices like Impella are available, or ECMO support is also available, and CentriMag device is available for these patients. So as I said, these are the life-threatening hypertensive episodes where these short-term mechanical support devices are needed to buy time, work them up, and find where we are heading for. ECMO generally in hemodynamic compromise will be VA ECMO. We know arterial. VV ECMO does not have a role. And accordingly, as the cannulas are placed in peripheral, so they are called peripheral ECMO or the central ECMO. So central ECMO, probably VA is more preferred because you don't have north-south phenomenon and you have less chances of limb compromise and perfusion defects. Centrimag is also available with us. This is durable long-term HeartMate 3 device, and it is used also for destination therapy. Transplantation in patients who are end-stage cardiac disease, non-retrievable myocardium. It is the gold standard surgical treatment, but as we know, that supply of donor hearts is too limited. And that's why other mechanical support devices with destination therapies are coming up. And these are some of the indications to help these patients with heart transplant. Especially notable here is debilitating ischemia not amenable to intervention or surgical revascularization. Here I will make a point as a surgeon who does many arterial grafts. With arterial grafts, with sequential grafting and many jumps, some of these so-called surgically inoperable cases may also be operable, and some of the myocardial retrieval may happen in surgeons' hands. So these are most of the indications where transplant has occurred. Of course, asymptomatic patients with manageable things should not be offered heart transplant. This is the algorithm I have come out with. So if you have advanced heart failure patients needing surgical management, if they are eligible for orthotopic heart transplantation, and if the heart is not available, then Bristol transplant may help them out. Or you may end up in long-term durable support if the heart has not been available to them, or you may find a heart and do the transplantation. Or some of these lucky guys may be so that their myocardium has recovered once VAD has been put in. Acute, as I said, acute events force you to short-term mechanical support devices, and Bristol decision helps you buy time. So some of those guys may head out to recovery, and some of these guys may end up with transplant, or some of these guys may end up with destination therapy. The guys who are ineligible for heart transplant definitely should be worked for long-term mechanical support devices accordingly. So coming to where we should say that, yes, this guy needs surgical help. So peak oxygen consumption less than 14 cc per kg per minute, or the guys who are tolerating beta blocker around 12 cc per kg per minute, 6 minutes walk test, less than 300 meter, reversible end organ damage, if at all that is there. So patients who need frequent hospitalizations, not manageable on OMT or synchronization therapy, recurrent or refractory ventricular tachyarrhythmias, and they are on inotropes and you're not able to wean them off, and acute and chronic heart failure needing some kind of support. So the guys who will be worked up for transplant definitely need to be on medical compliant, cognitive function okay. They should not have psychiatric disorder or abuse, and there definitely is very important that family support is needed. So patients who have end organ damage apart from heart, which is not reversible, definitely should not be candidates for this one. And I would again reinforce that before irreversible end organ damage is established, that's the time that clock should roll out. And to say that everything doesn't end then with them with OMT. There is things available surgically, and timely and appropriate selection may help them out. With this, I again thank you to give me ears and the luck to give me time. And thank you so much, really.
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Ramji, for wonderful exposition on what are the surgeries that can salvage these patients of ours who are failing optimal medical therapy. I think still the take-home message for this session, which I'm sure you will agree, we will try to look at heart failure, which is a huge subject in, from a case-based perspective, and how to institute guideline-directed therapy, and what is the perspective of surgical therapies for advanced heart failures. I think with the newer drugs that are available, showing us significant mortality benefits, many of our patients are benefiting and living good and productive lives for many years. But clearly, those patients who are failing this therapy or who have gone beyond the medications, there are definitely good surgical solutions that are available to us. If you look at it clearly, maybe surgical solutions that reverse or halt the progression of the disease, like aneurysm reconstruction or repair of the mitral valve, or CABG even in high-risk patients. And then when these options are not available, mechanical support in terms of either short-term or long-term, and finally, orthotopic cardiac transplantation, which again has its challenges. So I think we've covered the entire perspective of heart failure in this short session. I know that there are many gaps that have been left because there are so many details to fill, but I think this gives an overall view about how we can approach our patient. So if there are any other questions or comments, we would be very happy to take them. And if there is anyone would like to say something, or if that is okay, so we have got. Okay, so we have already answered the questions in the chat box. Would anyone else, if anyone else, if there are no other questions or observations, Salil, would you like to put in some concluding remarks before we close?
Yes, sir. Thanks a lot, sir. First of all, I would like to thank all the participants, Dr. Mehrotra and Priyasha especially. And the second point is that there were a few valid points made by both Dr. Hemant Madan and Dr. Madan, and also the cardiac anesthetist, which is a very important point because which we keep on seeing in our ICUs very frequently. The third important point is key with the therapies which medical therapies which have come up in the last 10 to 12 years, and especially with the new kids on block like ANI, SGLT2 and Evabrad. We are certainly seeing a reduction in hospitalization, mortality, and the things with the result that the heart transplants are going to become, the indications are going to change in the next few years.
Right.
And this is something, and especially having come from Delhi to Dehradun, I find that this is a virgin territory with the vast hinterland which lies ahead of us. We can do wonders out here because a lot of therapies, a lot of these eco sessions may be required out here before we can actually get off.
Sure. We will be more than happy to conduct such sessions, and we'll request you to become the hub at Dehradun and recruit more spokes so that more people can benefit from these sessions. And for advanced therapies, we have Dr. Ramji, who I can vouch for is my surgeon and an excellent surgeon. All right. So a little bit of plugging the surgeon is a good idea. We are happy that you joined us. So thank you everyone for your for your time and participation, and a big thanks to Priyasha. As a junior resident, not easy to present the case, so good for you. And please do more such sessions. It's beneficial to you only, maximum.
Yes.
All right. I think Anjali has Anjali runs a small poll or survey at the end of every session. Anjali, would you like to conclude, and then we'll close the session?
I have shared the feedback link in the chat box. Please check this and click on the link and kindly give the feedback of the session. I request everyone to do this, please. And you can also suggest if you would like to cover some topics, some particular topics, you can suggest certain topics in the WhatsApp group.
Thank you, sir. We'll do it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And
Thank you.
kindly give your feedback and then you can leave the session.